Get out of the way. This isn't a shelter. That's what a young white officer snapped, before slamming a 62-year-old black man to the floor of a courthouse lobby. No crime, no warning, just papers scattered, blood dripping, and silence, because his skin said threat before his voice ever could. But that old man was Jeremiah D. Knox, a decorated Navy SEAL, who once dragged 3 wounded soldiers out of enemy fire with a bullet in his own leg. One of those men, now a 4-star general who commands the very nation that tried to forget him. If America can push down the man who once saved its soldiers, who exactly is safe to stand? What state do you live in? And would silence win where you are? Because this isn't about a fall. It's about a country forced to face who it really protects. Let's begin. On Monday morning, the marble corridor of the Eastwood County Courthouse echoed with the steady footsteps of a 62-year-old black man. He wore a plain gray coat and carried a weathered leather briefcase worn smooth by time. No one paid him much attention, just an older gentleman walking a little slower than most. But those who had once fought beside him knew exactly who he was. Jeremiah D. Knox, former Navy SEAL, a man who had crossed a firestorm in Fallujah with 3 soldiers on his back and a bullet lodged in his leg. He wasn't there for himself. Jeremiah had come to testify in a veterans benefits case for his old friend Elliot Vance, a man who had lost a leg in combat. In his briefcase was a set of medical documents that could turn the entire case around. Undeniable proof. He walked quietly to the courtroom, door marked Courtroom 3B, when a voice stopped him cold. "Hold it." It was Officer Rhett Maddox, 28 years old, white, standing guard with a sharp gaze and the swagger of someone too familiar with misusing authority. His uniform was pressed to perfection, and the badge on his chest gleamed with the kind of power he had learned to wield recklessly. "You sure you're in the right place?" Maddox asked, his tone stripped of any courtesy. More an interrogation than a question, as if addressing a homeless man. Jeremiah nodded. "I'm here to testify in Mr. Vance's case. These are certified documents." Maddox's eyes scanned the folder briefly, then returned to Jeremiah's modest appearance. "You come alone? No lawyer? No rep? I'm a witness. I don't need representation." A brief pause. Then Maddox stepped forward, blocking his path. "Give me the file. I'll hand it over." Jeremiah tightened his grip on the briefcase. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "I'm sorry, officer. I've been instructed to deliver these directly to the court clerk. These are official records." Maddox's jaw clenched. "You talk like that means something." "I believe it does." What could have ended in silence turned into something else. Maddox suddenly shoved Jeremiah backward. The file fell to the floor, scattering open like wounded birds. Jeremiah hit the steps hard, his back slamming into the edge, his hand tearing open and bleeding. People in the hallway turned. Some held their breath. A small boy whispered to his mother, "Mom, why did he push that man? He didn't do anything wrong." Near the corner, a young college student named Naomi Reddick instinctively lifted her phone. She didn't know what she was about to capture, but something told her this moment would touch the conscience of a nation. Jeremiah planted one hand on the cold floor, the other reaching for the scattered pages, proof of the injustice Elliot Vance had endured. A legless veteran, denied medical benefits by the city of Ashwood after years of service. Though his hand trembled from pain and blood soaked into the paper, he gathered each sheet carefully. No one helped. Not a court official. Not a single uniform. Only a tightening silence filled the corridor, as if every bystander willed themselves not to see. Maddox remained above him, legs spread wide as though completing another routine task. No apology. No retreat. Just a stare that saw Jeremiah as an inconvenience, a presence out of place. But Jeremiah said nothing. No protest, no anger. He rose slowly, every motion reminiscent of the days he'd crawled out of shell holes, dragging wounded friends to safety under mortar fire. A man walked past, hesitating briefly, then kept walking. A mother clutched her child's hand tighter, eyes clouded with shame. Naomi kept filming, hand steady. Jeremiah breathed slowly. He tightened the blood-stained briefcase. In his mind, Elliot's voice echoed from just days before. If the court throws this out again, I've got nothing left. But I know you. If anyone can make them listen, it's you. Jeremiah took a step forward, past Maddox, not by force, but by dignity. Maddox stared at him, stunned that he kept moving. Where you going? Maddox snapped. Continuing the mission, Jeremiah replied, eyes unwavering. A quiet TSK came from Maddox, but he didn't stop him. Maybe he felt the shift in the room, how the silence had cracked open. At the clerk's desk, a young woman behind the glass paused when she saw the blood on his sleeve and the crumpled papers. Jeremiah opened the briefcase and pulled out the sealed file beneath the mess. Despite the fall, the key documents were intact. For the Elliot Vance case, he said, voice low and firm, I was summoned to testify. She nodded, accepting the folder. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, as though what she was holding weighed more than paper. Perhaps the weight of justice long delayed. Jeremiah turned, never glancing at Maddox again. He didn't need to. What needed to be done, he had done. Though humiliated, he hadn't faltered. He had arrived, on time, for the right reason. And no one, uniformed or powerful, could take that away from him. Jeremiah walked away from the clerk's desk, his palm still throbbing with pain, but he didn't look down. Somewhere along the marble corridor, the quiet murmur of conversation had died out. No one spoke, but every pair of eyes had shifted, no longer curious, but unsettled. The silence had stopped being indifference. It had become a collective discomfort. He retraced his steps to the row of waiting benches he had passed just minutes earlier. A little boy, maybe 7, wearing a mustard-yellow hoodie, was still staring at him. His big, dark eyes were wide open, as if still trying to understand why an old man was pushed down just for carrying medical documents. Sitting beside him was his mother, Celeste Harmon, frozen in place. She gently pulled her son closer and whispered, It's okay, baby. Just look away. But the boy didn't. Zion kept looking at Jeremiah, his eyes full of questions. And Jeremiah answered with a subtle nod. No words passed between them, but something did, a flicker of fire, burning quietly in a blood-stained hand. A few steps away, a man in an expensive suit leaned against a marble pillar, mouth open like he wanted to speak but didn't know how. A court clerk holding a clipboard stood frozen mid-stride, the red pen in her hand forgotten. Everyone saw. No one moved. At the far end of the hall, Naomi Reddick still held her phone aloft, the camera still recording. But now her hand trembled slightly. She wasn't sure whether to keep filming or stop. Anger, admiration, and guilt swirled inside her. Guilt for being part of a generation of law students taught to protect justice, yet never shown how it could be crushed in the open. Then a soft sound echoed, wheels rolling slowly across marble. Heads turned. A man in a wheelchair was approaching. His face was weathered, hair silvery and thin, arms sinewy as he pushed each wheel forward like he was guiding the weight of memory. It was Elliot Vance. No introduction needed. Anyone who knew Jeremiah knew his name. Elliot looked up at Jeremiah, squinting against the sunlight pouring through the window, then smiled gently. Still stubborn as ever, he said, voice gravelly, breaking the hush like a warm knife. They can break your bones, but they can't bend your spine. Laughter bubbled up from a corner, soft, but it spread. Then a few more chuckles, not mocking, but like exhaling after holding your breath too long. A middle-aged woman bit her lip to stop tears. A young white man shook his head, like wondering why he hadn't spoken up sooner. Jeremiah tilted his head slightly. I came to testify, not to perform, he replied. Well, you just gave the courtroom a show they won't forget, Elliot chuckled. And I guarantee they can't pretend not to see anymore. Naomi stopped recording. On her phone screen, Jeremiah still stood, shirt smeared with blood, gaze unwavering. And she knew she had captured something permanent, a truth etched in light. Jeremiah sat down at the back of the bench row, back straight as if he'd never been shoved. A thin line of blood still trailed across the cuff of his gray sleeve. His eyes remained fixed on the courtroom door, as if what had happened was just another gust in a soldier's life. Elliot rolled beside him, gripping the armrest without a word. But the tension in his left arm said it all. Rage held in place by will. No one in the hallway moved, as if the air in the Eastwood County Courthouse was waiting for someone, anyone, to break through the veil of apathy that had just been torn open. Then the courtroom door swung open. Out stepped Judge Vernon Beckwith. Tall, white, his silver hair neatly combed, black robe flowing behind each calculated step. He paused, eyes scanning the tense corridor. His gaze landed on Jeremiah for a heartbeat, then shifted to Maddox, who still stood rigid, face carved in stone. And just like that, Beckwith nodded to Maddox and turned back inside. No words, no recognition. The hallway's mood shifted again, this time not to silence, but to shock. Naomi gripped her phone, lips parted as if trying to form a sentence she hadn't yet found. Elliot leaned toward Jeremiah and said with a bitter smile, "I've seen commanders abandon soldiers in battlefields, but I've never seen someone walk away from honor under a courtroom spotlight." And just then, a small voice pierced the crowd. "Mom, why did that man get pushed down?" Everyone turned. Zion, his round eyes wide and small fingers gripping his mother's hand, looked straight at Jeremiah. His question wasn't just a child's confusion. It was a blade slicing through the moral fog that coated the room. Celeste Harmon sat frozen, her lips tight in a battle between fear and the duty of motherhood. She leaned down, but Zion wasn't done. "He's a good man, right, Mom? Then why is everyone so quiet?" Maddox curled his lips into a smirk, half sneer, half defense, but he didn't get a chance to respond. A sharp click echoed from the ceiling. Every head tilted upward. A surveillance camera, half hidden and presumed dead, was blinking red. From the far end of the hall, a technician stepped out, face pale as he saw every eye locked on him. In his hand, the mobile control panel flashed a single line. "System active, auto archive enabled." "That camera, has it been recording this whole time?" Naomi asked aloud. The technician swallowed hard. "It rebooted at 9:17 a.m. New system update. I didn't know it would catch." The air snapped like an overstretched wire breaking. An elderly woman nodded from the back row. "Then the truth doesn't need retelling anymore." Jeremiah said nothing, but his eyes slowly shifted from Zion to the blinking red light above. It wasn't just words anymore, not just stares. The truth now had a witness, and this time it had evidence. The red light on the ceiling camera kept blinking. No one dared to speak after the technician's words. The atmosphere in the Eastwood County Courthouse wasn't one of shock anymore. It was something else now. A slow, irreversible shift. As if the building itself had realized, some things, once exposed, cannot be hidden again. Then a quiet movement stirred on the second row, right side. An elderly man stood up. He was tall, with a head of pure white hair, dressed in a dark gray suit with a small American flag pin on his lapel. No introduction was necessary. That face had appeared in military history books, on the covers of top defense magazines. Some recognized him instantly. General Tobias Ward, former commander of the Eastern Expeditionary Force, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for valor in Kandahar. Tobias walked into the center of the hallway without waiting for permission. He didn't look at Maddox, didn't glance at Judge Beckwith still watching from afar, nor at Naomi or anyone filming. His eyes locked on one man only, Jeremiah D. Knox. "That man," Tobias said, his voice low and resonant, echoing like a drumbeat in the chest, "is the reason I'm alive to stand here today." The entire corridor froze. Tobias continued, pointing directly at Jeremiah, "Was my commanding officer during a rescue op in Sector Sinai, just outside Kandahar. When our helicopter was shot down and 3 men were trapped, he didn't order retreat. He went back. Alone." Maddox stood rigid, jaw clenched. Jeremiah didn't move. His eyes remained unchanged, as if long resigned to people only remembering him when a medal was convenient. But Tobias's words weren't for honor. They were a scalpel, slicing through the toxic quiet. He carried each one out on his back, under enemy fire. "I was the last. And if any of you have someone today leading veterans boards or teaching cadets about duty and honor, It's because Jeremiah Knox didn't turn his back. Tobias stepped forward, stopping 3 paces from Jeremiah. Then, without warning, he raised his right hand, palm pressed firmly to his brow. A military salute, not for rank, but for a soldier, a brother, a living legend. No one moved. Naomi hit record again. Zion held his breath. Maddox swallowed hard. Even Judge Beckwith, watching from the far end, unconsciously leaned forward, his eyes showing for the first time a flicker of doubt. Jeremiah slowly rose. He didn't return the salute, but he nodded barely. Nothing else was needed, because in that moment, the entire system that had pretended not to see him was now forced to bear witness. And for Jeremiah Knox, that was enough. Just hours after General Tobias Ward saluted Jeremiah in the middle of the Eastwood County Courthouse hallway, Naomi Reddick's phone video was uploaded online. She added no music, no filters, no edits, just raw footage. Jeremiah being shoved, Zion's gaze, Beckwith's silence, and a salute that turned a courthouse into stone. It started with a few hundred views, then thousands, then millions. By that evening, the video had reached every corner of the country. Headlines erupted on news sites and broadcasts. War hero humiliated in local courtroom. Security camera unveils truth. Honor or prejudice? A general salute stuns the nation. On social media, the hashtag #RiseWithKnox exploded like a wildfire. Young people began digging into Jeremiah's record. Veterans across the country posted photos of themselves standing at attention, hand over heart, as the video played on screens behind them. A student group in Colorado wore red armbands bearing his name. A former Iraq vet wrote, "He didn't need to speak. Just standing up like that forced the entire system to listen." On national television that night, veteran anchor Grant McConnell sat silent for several seconds after airing the clip. He set aside his script, looked directly into the camera, and with a voice thick with emotion said, "If this is how we treat a man who fought for freedom, then maybe we need to redefine what freedom even means." A moral shockwave began to ripple outward. The Ashwood City Council was forced to convene an emergency session to respond to media pressure. An internal survey revealed over 78% of residents supported the immediate suspension of Officer Rhett Maddox. But it didn't stop there. Questions began to surface. Was this the first time? How many incidents went unrecorded? How many were treated like Jeremiah, with no one there to witness it? In Wexley Borough, where Jeremiah once trained new recruits in the 1990s, a spontaneous memorial wall appeared on the side of the community library. Locals brought flowers, handwritten notes, old service pins, even printed stills from the viral video. One 8-year-old girl placed a small paper bag with a note inside that read, "You're my hero. I'm going to tell my class about you." Jeremiah, however, still didn't say a word. He posted nothing, answered no reporters, accepted no interviews. He simply returned to Elliot Vance's modest apartment, where 2 old friends sat at a worn wooden table, sharing a cup of black coffee and quietly listening to the news on the radio. "Guess I'm famous now," Elliot said with a soft chuckle. Jeremiah took a sip. "Not because I wanted to be." Elliot nodded. "I know, but maybe this time your silence is the loudest thing in the room." 3 days after the video swept across the nation, the square outside Eastwood County Courthouse was no longer a place of cautious footsteps. It had become a sea of people. Veterans in faded uniforms, college students, nurses, factory workers, teachers. Waves of people poured in from neighboring towns. They didn't carry angry slogans. Instead, they raised quiet signs that read, "He stood up. Now it's our turn. Honor is not for sale." And in the center, the largest one, #RiseWithKnox. A makeshift brass band of veterans played Amazing Grace. Under its melody, Naomi Reddick led a group of law students from Ashgate University, clutching a stack of petitions. Beside her stood Celeste Harmon, wearing a mustard yellow coat, holding the hand of her son Zion, the little boy who had become a symbol of an innocent question that shook a nation. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, the pressure was rising like a sealed pot about to blow. Officer Rhett Maddox entered through a rear staff entrance. He no longer walked with swagger. His eyes darted around, avoiding the gauntlet of cameras lined at the front gate. But he had no idea what awaited him. Up on the third floor, a closed-door meeting was being held by representatives from the FIU, Federal Integrity Unit. A silver-haired woman in a blue button-down shirt, her name tag reading Delphine Rook, placed a thick new case file in front of each person at the table. "We've just confirmed," she said, "Officer Maddox has had at least 5 prior complaints regarding use of force and racial bias. All were marked as internally resolved with no review." A young prosecutor slammed his palm on the table. "And now what?" "Now," Delphine replied, voice cold as steel, "we're reopening all of them." At that exact moment, something unexpected happened outside. A black SUV, with no plates, pulled up in front of the crowd. 2 men in black suits and dark sunglasses stepped out and walked briskly toward the west entrance. No one knew who they were, but within minutes, Judge Vernon Beckwith was escorted out of the courtroom by a court officer. News spread like wildfire. Judge under investigation. FIU takes action. The crowd erupted. A woman wept openly. A middle-aged white man stood in silent salute to Jeremiah. At the far end, Marissa Quinn, a local TV reporter, was broadcasting live. She spoke into the camera. "We've just confirmed that Maddox's complaint files are being officially reopened, and Judge Beckwith may now face a federal investigation for dereliction of duty on the bench." At that very moment, a sound began to rise. Not anger, not chanting, but a deep, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The crowd began clapping, slowly, deliberately, in unison. And through that rising sound, Jeremiah D. Knox quietly appeared behind the side door. He didn't step forward, didn't wave. He simply stood there, and the entire square turned toward him. No rallying cry, no bold statement, just the presence of a man who had once been shoved down and chose to stand again. And this time, an entire city stood with him. A week after the historic demonstration at Eastwood County Courthouse Square, a military aircraft touched down at Andrews Air Force Base, just outside Washington, D.C., waiting beside an armored transport vehicle. A group of senior officers opened the door for the sole guest of honor, Jeremiah D. Knox. He stepped down slowly. No uniform, no medals, just an old gray coat still stained with the blood from that day in Ashwood. But this time, he wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Naomi Reddick, the woman who filmed the original video. Just behind them was Elliot Vance, in a wheelchair, wearing a cap embroidered with Kandahar, 2006, We Never Leave Our Own. At the headquarters of the Orion Federal Ethics Tribunal, a glass-walled building that gleamed like a mirror reflecting the soul of the nation, Jeremiah was invited to speak at a special federal hearing, attended by members of the FIU, Federal Integrity Unit, U.S. senators, military veterans, and officials from the Department of Justice. The hall was packed. Bright lights. Every news camera pointed at the podium in the center. Names like CNN, NPR, and independent news outlets were all present. In the front row sat General Tobias Ward, upright, hands clasped before him. Zion Harmon sat in the second row with his mother, his round face tense, but his eyes steady. The presiding officer announced Jeremiah's name. Applause filled the room. But as he stepped up to the microphone, he didn't speak right away. He just stood there. No gestures, no expression, not seeking any gaze. 1 minute. 2. The entire room held its breath. Then finally, he locked eyes with the moderator. "They asked why I didn't say anything when I was shoved to the ground in that courtroom," Jeremiah began, his voice deep, like it rose from the earth itself. "I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't resist. But I did speak." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across every face in that breathless room. "By the way, I stood up." Silence followed. And then the entire hall erupted, not with loud applause, but with movement. One by one, everyone stood, committee members, veterans, reporters, students, all silently rising to their feet. No slogans, no chants, just standing, as he had, a silent act that thundered like a storm. A little girl in the third row whispered to her mother, "He doesn't have to say much, huh?" Celeste nodded, eyes wet, a quiet smile on her lips. Because some things don't need to be shouted. In the corner, Naomi wiped off her camera lens. She didn't know how many views the footage would get tonight, but she knew one thing: it would outlast any headline. Because one man stood up, and this time, the entire nation saw him. The next morning, Jeremiah D. Knox's words were printed in bold on the front page of nearly every major newspaper. I did speak in the way I got up. Just 7 words, but louder than any speech that lasts hours. At a high school in the suburbs of Wexley Borough, the history teacher skipped the usual lesson and projected the hearing video onto the big screen. Standing at the front, arms folded, pride in her eyes, she told the class, "Today, we're not studying the past. We're learning from the present." In the back, a small white boy scribbled those words onto the corner of his backpack with a pen. At a rehab center for veterans in Ashwood, patients sat in a circle, quietly watching the clip on a wall-mounted screen. One man with a missing arm chuckled hoarsely. "Damn, I used to think I couldn't hold my head up again. But that man makes me want to stand tall." Online, the hashtag #RiseWithKnox merged with his quote, going viral. People began sharing moments when they stood up, literally or figuratively. A nurse told of refusing to be pressured into unethical care. A single father wrote about defending his son from school discrimination. A firefighter shared a photo leaving physical therapy after a blast injury, captioned, "I did speak in the way I stood." At FIU headquarters, their internal bulletin board was updated. Amid the policies and investigative updates, one bold red-framed quote stood out. "Sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't spoken. It's how you rise after being knocked down." Even the most conservative military institutions began to shift. A training school in North Carolina petitioned to include Jeremiah's video in its ethics curriculum. They called it the Knox scenario. On a late-night talk show, the host stood up mid-monologue and turned to the crowd. "I used to think only the loudest voices got heard. But then a 62-year-old man didn't shout, didn't strike back, didn't even speak, and made an entire nation stop and listen." The audience erupted in applause. That night, Jeremiah sat quietly at the edge of Elliot Vance's porch. He held a cup of hot tea, staring off at the dim golden lights reflecting on the sidewalk. Naomi Reddick arrived, carrying a paper bag with sandwiches. She sat beside him, slipping off her heels. "You know," she said, "they just printed 10,000 shirts with your quote on them." Jeremiah took a slow sip of tea. "I don't need a shirt. But people need it," Naomi smiled. "They need something to remind them that standing up is also a way to speak." Jeremiah nodded gently. Then he said, barely louder than a breeze, "As long as they don't forget why they stood." And in that moment, amid the hum of the city and the distant sound of car horns, those quiet words echoed like a deep bell in the hearts of those who still believed in dignity. Just 3 days after the federal hearing, the FIU, Federal Integrity Unit, officially announced the suspension of Officer Rhett Maddox from all duties involving civilian interaction, effective immediately. No longer strutting through courthouse halls with his gleaming badge, Maddox now quietly packed up his desk at the Ashwood Police Department under the cold stares of colleagues who had once silently enabled him. On television, the FIU spokesperson confirmed, "We have identified at least 5 incidents involving abuse of power and discriminatory conduct that were never properly addressed. All cases will now be reinvestigated under the designation Operation Deep Cell." Simultaneously, Judge Vernon Beckwith, who had looked away when Jeremiah was shoved, was summoned by the Federal Ethics Commission. For the first time in nearly 2 decades on the bench, he had to face the question that should have been asked long ago. When justice was assaulted right before your eyes, why did you remain silent? On the evening news, Grant McConnell stared straight into the camera. His voice was no longer outraged. It was cold, like a closing indictment. "We didn't just witness a man being pushed. We witnessed an entire system flinch at morality. And this time, it will have to answer." At Eastwood County Courthouse, new signs were posted. Going forward, all interactions with witnesses must be recorded via personal wrist devices. A statewide training series was launched across Georgia titled Ethical Conduct and Moral Courage in Public Duty. Naomi Reddick was invited to speak at the first event. She stood at the podium, still holding the phone that had captured the video that shook a nation. Courage, she said, doesn't always come with a roar. Sometimes it's just a 62-year-old man forcing himself to stand back up after being knocked down and refusing to leave the building. Change spread faster than anyone expected. Within 2 weeks, 5 more cities, including Wexley-Borough and Clearhaven, signed commitments to reform police training and include the Knox scenario in their curriculum. A t-shirt company in Texas reported over 70,000 orders for the design featuring the quote, "I did speak in a way I got up." Meanwhile, on TikTok, a new trend emerged. People filmed themselves standing up for moments of bullying, dismissal, or exclusion, and ending the clip by staring directly into the camera, saying nothing. At Elliot Vance's small apartment, Jeremiah still kept his habit of sitting on the porch at dusk. When Naomi arrived, carrying a newspaper with a headline, "Officer Maddox, now officially under criminal investigation," he only nodded slightly. "See," Elliot said, lifting his teacup. "You didn't say a word. And now the whole system is finally speaking." Jeremiah didn't respond right away. A yellow leaf drifted onto the porch. A soft breeze rustled the trees. "Truth is," he said, voice low, "I just stood up like so many others who've been knocked down. The difference is this time, people saw it. And that, for him, was a beginning, not an ending. A turning point, in the truest sense." On Monday morning, with dew still clinging to the stone steps and the sunlight barely breaking through the trees outside Eastwood County Courthouse, a team of workers quietly pulled the white cloth off a newly completed bronze statue. There was no orchestra, no grand speech, no mayor with a ribbon. But the square was already filled with people, veterans in worn uniforms, students in school dress, mothers with children in strollers, and those that didn't even know why they were there, only that they could not be. The statue stood roughly 6 feet tall, depicting Jeremiah D. Knox sitting, not in a heroic pose, not holding a weapon or raising a salute. He was simply seated, calm, upright, one hand resting on a worn briefcase, his gaze cast into the distance, as if still watching for something important yet to happen. The sculptor, a veteran who had served in Fallujah, spent 6 weeks just carving the expression. "I didn't want to sculpt a hero," he said. "I wanted to sculpt a man who held himself together when everything else was falling apart." Beneath the statue, a small bronze plaque bore only one line. He didn't need to shout to be heard. Zion Harmon, standing near the statue, gripped his mother's hand. He recognized that gaze, the same one that had turned to him in that courthouse hallway. "Mom," he whispered, "he's still watching, isn't he?" Celeste didn't answer right away. She only nodded, as if trying to hold back tears in front of the silent crowd. Not far away, Naomi Reddick stood beside Elliot Vance, who had just recovered from a brief hospital stay. Elliot placed a single white lily at the base of the statue, then looked up. "It's not because he once saved my life," he said. "It's because he restored what's right in each of us." From that day on, the area around the courthouse became a quiet place of pilgrimage. No one asked them to come. No signs directed them. But people kept arriving. Some brought neatly folded flags. Some left small notes with trembling handwriting. "Thank you for standing up for my father." A group of high school students from Wexley-Borough came on a class trip. Their teacher asked them to write a short essay on what they learned. A curly-haired girl stood up to read hers aloud. "Sometimes the greatest lesson isn't in the victory, but in the moment someone chooses not to bow before injustice." And this time, everyone heard it. Not because Jeremiah asked them to, but because, finally, the world had learned how to listen to silence the right way. One late afternoon, Jeremiah D. Knox drove his old, rust-toned pickup truck west out of Ashwood, Georgia. No escort, no media, just him, the wind, and the familiar road that led to where she had once been laid to rest. By the time he reached the gates of Hillcrest Memorial Grounds, the sky was already dimming. He carried a bouquet of white lilies and walked slowly toward the eastern section, where a small headstone bore the name. Clara M. Knox. She healed where others broke. Jeremiah knelt, both knees pressing into the cool grass. He placed the flowers gently down, then rested his hand on the edge of the stone. No tears, no whispered words, and yet the air around him seemed to still. I did it, Clara, he thought. But he didn't speak it aloud. He knew she understood, just as she always had in life. She never needed him to explain anything. She only needed him to hold true to himself, even when the world didn't. The crunch of gravel behind him made him turn. A young mother was walking hand in hand with her son, carrying a bouquet of artificial flowers and 2 small candles. The boy stopped in the middle of the path, looking at Jeremiah as if he recognized him. "Mom," he whispered, "that's him. That's the man who stood up when no one else would." The mother looked at Jeremiah, her eyes pausing. She said nothing, just bowed her head deeply and led her son onward, leaving behind a sentence that didn't need a response, because it already meant enough. Jeremiah stayed beside the grave. The wind moved through the pines, carrying with it the scent of sap and memory. He didn't need anyone to honor him. No medals, no slogans, because he knew what makes a person unforgettable isn't how loud they rise. It's how they stand firm when no one else will. From the moment he was shoved in that courthouse hallway to the day an entire nation stood with him, he had never raised his voice. But that silence, upright, unshaken, had forced an entire system to look itself in a mirror. Jeremiah's silence was never avoidance. It was a wordless declaration. That morality doesn't need a microphone. That dignity doesn't need a loudspeaker. And that justice sometimes only needs one person who doesn't back down to become a mirror for the millions still bowed in silence. As he left the cemetery, the sun had dipped behind the far hills. But the glow of dusk still clung to the headstones, to his shirt front, and to every footprint he left behind. No one needed to remind him of the weight of what he'd done, because he had already spoken the clearest message. From the very first moment he stood, and the greatest lesson he left behind wasn't in any speech. It lived in how he walked, how he fell, and most of all, how he got back up